I've always loved the mountains. Something about their towering majesty, the pristine snow, the biting cold that stings your face as you carve through powder. It's intoxicating. Skiing has been my escape since I was a teenager, a place where I could leave everything behind. But after what happened last February, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot on a slope again. It started as a last-minute trip with my best friend Alex. We'd planned to hit a resort in Colorado, but a snowstorm forced us to change course. Alex found this little-known lodge tucked away in the Montana Rockies. The website boasted untouched runs and an authentic backcountry experience. It sounded perfect. We arrived late at night. The lodge was smaller than I'd imagined, more rustic. A single-story structure with weathered wood siding. It looked like it had been plucked straight from a 1970s postcard. The owner, an older man named George, greeted us at the door. He was tall and wiry, with a face that seemed carved from stone. His handshake was firm, almost too firm. "Welcome," he said, his voice gravelly. "You're the only guests this week. Snowstorms scared everyone off." That should have been our first warning. The first day was magical. The snow was fresh, the sky impossibly blue. Alex and I spent hours exploring the untouched runs, weaving through trees and carving down open faces. It felt like we had the entire mountain to ourselves. By the time we returned to the lodge that evening, we were exhausted but exhilarated. George had dinner waiting for us, hearty stew and freshly baked bread. He joined us at the table, regaling us with stories of the mountain. One in particular stuck with me. "They call it Whispering Hollow," he said, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "A narrow chute on the backside of the mountain. Locals say it's cursed. Folks who ski it, they don't come back." I laughed nervously, glancing at Alex. He smirked, clearly unimpressed. "What happens to them?" I asked, playing along. George shrugged, his eyes dark. "Some say they get lost. Others, they hear things. Voices that lead them deeper into the wilderness. By the time they realize what's happening, it's too late." After dinner, Alex and I joked about it, chalking it up to George trying to spook us. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The lodge was silent, save for the occasional groan of the wind outside. Shadows danced on the walls, and every creak of the old building made me flinch. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a restless sleep. The next morning, Alex was buzzing with excitement. "Let's find Whispering Hollow," he said over breakfast, his eyes gleaming with mischief. I hesitated. "Come on, man. George said it's dangerous." "You don't actually believe that crap, do you?" he scoffed. "It's probably just a steep chute. We'll check it out, take some pictures, and head back." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We spent the morning searching for the entrance to Whispering Hollow. It wasn't marked on the map George had given us, but Alex was determined. Around midday, we found it. A narrow gap between two massive rock walls, partially obscured by trees. The air inside felt colder, heavier. "This has to be it," Alex said, grinning. As we entered the chute, the world seemed to change. The sun disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, and the wind picked up, howling through the narrow passage. The snow beneath our skis felt different, harder, slicker. I told myself it was just my imagination. The chute twisted and turned, growing steeper with every curve. Trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Then, I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was the wind. But as we descended further, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words exactly, just fragments of sound, like someone trying to speak underwater. I glanced at Alex, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the slope ahead, his movements fluid and confident. "Alex," I called out, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He stopped and looked back at me, confused. "Hear what?" Before I could respond, the ground beneath me shifted. It was subtle at first, a barely perceptible tremor. Then, with a deafening crack, the snow gave way. "Avalanche!" Alex screamed. I barely had time to react. The world exploded into a blinding blur of white as the snow swallowed me whole. I tumbled, disoriented, struggling to breathe. When the avalanche finally stopped, I was buried chest deep. My heart pounded as I clawed my way to the surface, gasping for air. "Alex!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. There was no response. Frantically, I scanned the slope. 100 feet below me, I saw a patch of red, Alex's jacket. I scrambled towards it, my legs shaking with every step. When I reached him, he was lying motionless, half buried in the snow. "Alex, wake up!" I cried, shaking him. His eyes fluttered open, and relief washed over me. I'm okay," he murmured, wincing as he tried to move. "I think my leg's broken." We were miles from the lodge, with no way to call for help. My phone had been lost in the avalanche, and Alex's was smashed. As the whispers grew louder around us, I realized we had only one option. I had to find a way back on my own. "Stay here," I told Alex, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll get help." He nodded weakly, his face pale with pain. I grabbed a makeshift crutch from a fallen branch and set off, the weight of his life pressing heavily on my shoulders. The journey back was a nightmare. The whispers followed me, growing more insistent, more sinister. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees. At one point, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, a shadowy silhouette standing perfectly still. But when I blinked, it was gone. By the time I reached the lodge, night had fallen. George was waiting for me, his expression grim. When I told him what had happened, he grabbed a flashlight and a first aid kit without a word. Together, we made our way back to the chute. But Alex was gone. The patch of red where he'd lain was undisturbed, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. I called his name until my throat was raw, but there was no answer. George searched the area methodically, his face unreadable. Finally, he turned to me. "We need to go," he said quietly. "It's not safe here." I wanted to argue, to keep looking, but something in his eyes stopped me. We returned to the lodge in silence. I reported Alex's disappearance to the authorities the next morning. They launched a search and rescue operation, but no trace of him was ever found. Whispering Hollow was sealed off, declared off limits to skiers. George never spoke of it again, and I never returned to the lodge. Sometimes late at night I hear whispers outside my window. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. And I can't help but wonder if Alex is out there somewhere, lost in the snow, calling for me to come back. I've been skiing for over a decade, and I always thought I'd seen it all. Blizzards, avalanches, even a sprained ankle miles away from any help. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night in the remote mountains of British Columbia. It started as a dream trip. My best friend Nate and I had planned it for months, a week of backcountry skiing far from the bustling resorts. Just us, the snow, and the wilderness. We hired a guide, Eric, a grizzled local who knew the terrain like the back of his hand. Eric warned us about the risks. The weather could turn on a dime, the terrain was unforgiving, and we'd be miles from help. But we were confident, maybe too confident. The first few days were incredible. Powder so deep it felt like floating, sunlit peaks stretching endlessly in every direction. By the third day, we were venturing deeper into the backcountry. That morning, Eric checked the forecast and hesitated. "Storm's rolling in tonight," he said, his voice grim. "We should stay close to camp." But Nate, ever the adrenaline junkie, convinced him otherwise. "We've got all day," he argued. "We'll be back before it hits." Reluctantly, Eric agreed. We set off early, trekking to a remote ridge Eric claimed had the best runs in the region. And he wasn't wrong. The snow was perfect, untouched. We spent hours carving through pristine slopes, the sheer beauty of it intoxicating. But by mid-afternoon, the sky began to darken. Heavy clouds rolled in, swallowing the sun and casting the mountains in a ghostly gray. "We need to head back," Eric said sharply, scanning the horizon. Nate and I nodded, suddenly sober. The wind picked up as we started the trek back. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier. Within an hour, we were in the thick of it. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the world around us turned into a swirling white void. Eric led the way, his movements deliberate and focused. But something felt off. The terrain seemed unfamiliar, the landmarks obscured by the storm. Eric paused frequently, checking his GPS, muttering to himself. Nate and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Are we lost?" I finally asked, my voice barely audible over the howling wind. Eric didn't answer right away. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. "We've drifted off course, but don't worry, I'll get us back." We pressed on, but the storm only grew fiercer. The wind was like a living thing, pushing against us, biting through our layers. The falling snow blurred the line between ground and sky, and every step felt like trudging through quicksand. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and fear began to creep in. That's when we saw it. A cabin, barely visible through the blizzard. It was old, weathered, and looked abandoned, but it was shelter. "We'll wait out the storm here," Eric decided. The cabin was as dilapidated inside as it looked outside. The walls were thin, the air icy, and the only light came from our headlamps. But it was a relief to get out of the wind. Eric tried to radio for help, but the storm had killed the signal. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. We huddled close, sharing what little warmth we could. That's when the noises started. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was a faint scratching, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. "Probably just an animal," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. We tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing on the wooden floor. Nate shone his headlamp toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. No response. Just the wind outside and the creaking of the old cabin. "We're all hearing this, right?" I asked, my heart pounding. Eric nodded, his face pale. He gripped his ice axe tightly, his eyes scanning the room. Suddenly, the door slammed open, the wind howling inside. Snow swirled around us, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway. Tall, shadowy, motionless. Then it was gone, as if swallowed by the storm. We barricaded the door and stayed awake the rest of the night, our nerves frayed, every sound making us jump. By morning, the storm had eased, and we decided to leave. The cabin felt suffocating, its walls closing in on us. As we stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin. They weren't ours. They were too large, too spaced out. And they led to nowhere, disappearing into the untouched snow. None of us spoke as we made our way back to camp, the tension palpable. Eric never mentioned the cabin again, and neither did Nate. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints, and I wonder who or what was out there with us in the storm. I'd been skiing since I was a kid, raised in the mountains, so I thought I knew every curve and crevice of the slopes. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was supposed to be a routine trip, an escape from the grind of the city, a chance to unwind with some friends. We were at an isolated resort up in the Rockies, known for its pristine powder and a near-empty slope after hours. A perfect place for those of us who liked the solitude, and I loved that. No crowds, no distractions, just the peaceful rush of the wind, the snow, and the occasional sound of skis slicing through the soft powder. The resort had been quiet, almost too quiet. We were the last group on the mountain that evening, taking the final lift up as the sun dipped behind the peaks. As we reached the summit, a thick fog had started to roll in, unusual for the time of year, but we didn't think much of it. The weather had been unpredictable all day. I remember the eerie silence. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my own breathing as I stepped off the lift, my skis carving into the fresh snow. My friends and I joked around, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of being watched. Then I noticed something strange. The lift operator was gone. We hadn't seen him leave, but the chairlift was still running, its eerie creaks echoing in the fog. We were far from the lodge, and it seemed odd that no one had noticed the absence of staff. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was too focused on the thrill of the descent. We skied down a few runs, our laughter breaking through the oppressive silence of the mountain. But as the evening wore on, the fog thickened, and with it, an unsettling feeling began to grow in my gut. The mountain felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. We decided to take one last run before heading in for the night. The others were ahead of me, cutting through the fog, their figures barely visible in the mist. But as I reached the edge of the run, something caught my eye. A shadow, just at the edge of the trees. A figure standing still, facing away from me. I slowed down, my heart beginning to pound. It didn't seem like one of my friends. No one else should have been up here. But then, just as I was about to call out, the figure turned around. At first, I thought it was someone in a ski suit, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was wrong. This figure wasn't wearing ski gear. It was dressed in old, tattered clothing, like something you'd see in a horror movie. And the face, or what was left of it, was something I'll never forget. It was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. No expression, no movement, just empty. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as the figure slowly lifted a hand. At first I thought it was a wave, but then it pointed, directly at me. That's when I heard it. A faint scraping noise from the trees, like something was moving through the snow. And then another figure emerged from the fog, and then another. I snapped out of my trance and turned to ski back to my friends. But as I pushed off, I felt the snow beneath my skis shift, like something was pulling me down. I looked back to see the figure still standing, unmoving, staring right at me. My friends were now nowhere in sight. Panic surged through me, and I skied faster, my breaths ragged in the cold air. But the fog seemed to thicken with every turn I made, the world around me narrowing until all I could see was the wall of mist closing in. I had to get back to the lodge. I had to. The mountain was alive with something. Something I couldn't explain. I didn't know how much time had passed or how far I'd skied, but I knew I was lost. The familiar trails had vanished, and all I could see was the fog and the darkness. I tried calling out to my friends, but my voice was swallowed by the dense air. The scraping noise continued, now louder, almost like footsteps crunching in the snow. And then, something else. A whisper, low and chilling, coming from behind me. Don't run. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline coursing through my veins as my heart raced in panic. But the whisper was followed by more, voices that seemed to come from all directions. You'll never escape. I turned sharply, my skis losing traction, but I caught myself just in time. The figure was gone, but I could still hear the voices, clearer now, louder. Lost, the whispers echoed. Trapped. That's when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the fog, I saw the lights of the lodge. I didn't care how far I had to go. I had to reach it. But as I skied towards the lodge, something was wrong. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't the lodge. It was a shadow of it. A dark, twisted version, like a distorted reflection in a broken mirror. The windows were dark, no lights shining, and the door was slightly ajar. I skied closer, my muscles burning, but something in the back of my mind screamed at me to stop. But I couldn't. I needed to reach safety. I reached the door and pushed it open, expecting to find warmth and light. Instead, it was cold, freezing. I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me. The room was pitch black, but I could hear movement, soft and steady, like someone, or something, was in there with me. I reached for my phone, but it had no signal. The whispers returned, now inside my head. You shouldn't have come. I spun around, my breath shallow. And then, a figure emerged from the dark. One I recognized. My friend. But his eyes, they were wrong. Empty. Hollow. The last thing I remember was his voice, not his own, but something deeper. more distorted. The fog, the shadows, the figures. They were all part of something I didn't understand. And I was part of it now. The next morning I woke up at the base of the mountain, alone. The fog had lifted, the sun shining down, as though nothing had happened. My friends were nowhere to be found. The lodge was empty too, and the lift was running again, like it was a regular day. No one knew where we had gone. I never went back to those slopes. Something in me knew it was still there, lurking in the mist, waiting for the next fool who thought they knew the mountain. I'm just lucky I got out when I did. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe we never really leave.